So, you just picked up your first Warhammer miniature, or maybe you have 500 unpainted minis in your collection. And now you want to be able to play with your miniatures as soon as possible, yet still trick your friends into believing that you're better at painting than you actually are. It might seem daunting. Slapchop is by far the fastest and easiest way to get your miniatures painted to a decent standard with low effort. Let me show you how, let's talk about why it's good, and most importantly, why I don't recommend it, even for beginners. Okay, so we want to impress our friends with fully painted armies, but we don't have a ton of time. And maybe not a ton of money to buy a bazillion different types of paints. But if you've managed to spray prime your miniatures black, we are ready to start painting. As long as you've got a white or an ivory paint, you can grab a dry brush or a large makeup brush. On one side of the spectrum we got cheap, wish-ordered makeup brushes, and on the other side we got Kolinsky hair on the Artist Opus dry brush. Both of these work perfectly fine. We just make sure that our brush is just a little bit moist. The brush shouldn't be fully dry, despite the name dry brush. Normally I just lightly dip the brush in water and then remove most of the moist on a piece of paper or cloth. After that, we're ready to add paint to our dry brush. I'm going to use Vallejo White from our Essential paint set. Just add a little bit to the brush and remove the excess of it on a dry brush texture palette. But if you don't have a texture palette, you can just remove the excess on a piece of paper. We need to find our magic spot, where we just have enough amount of pigments in the bristles that the paint only stick to the raised areas of the miniature and leave all the cracks and crevices dark. Once your miniatures look something like this, you are ready to now start applying color. And this is where the magic happens. We are going to use something that we refer to as contrast paints. This is a semi-translucent paint that pulls in the cracks and crevices and creates sort of an effect where the most raised areas are brighter and more vibrant, and the darker areas where more of the paint collects, it gets darker and a little bit more shaded. There are multiple different brands that offer what we refer to as contrast paints. Vallejo have their Express Color, Games Workshop have contrast paints, and Army Painter have speed paints. When it comes to this type of paint, we mostly use contrast paints, so for ease of this video, I'm going to stick to that line of paint through the entire video. We simply take the colors that we want and carefully apply it to the parts where we want the color to cover. In this case, I'm painting on some of my squigs and trolls and a space marine. I'm using some reds for the skin, adding wildwood to the claws and skeleton horde to the teeth, and adding some pink to the mouth. With these 3 steps alone, we've got fully playable miniatures. But let's try this technique on a few more minis like our troll and a space marine. While contrast paints can work wonders by providing a quick shade and color in one step, you do need to be careful with how you apply them. The key thing to remember is that contrast paints are translucent, meaning that they will settle into the recesses of your models but also remain visible in the lighter areas. If you accidentally get some paints in spots where it shouldn't be, it is going to show through in the next layers that you apply. As an example, if you accidentally splash contrast paints into one of the wrong areas of your miniatures, you're doing this leather thing and it goes onto the skin of the troll. It will blend with the next layer you apply, creating a muddy and uneven result. And there's no easy way of cleaning that up without going back and reapplying white again first. Since the contrast paints are high flow, it means that they sometimes will pool in areas, creating a slight discoloration in places where it shouldn't be. To avoid this, apply contrast paint carefully with control. I recommend using a fresh synthetic brush with a good tip to give you more control and also work on smaller areas at a time. And make sure to finish each area before you move to the next one. Because if you let it dry and then apply another layer, these 2 different layers are going to overlap and be darker where the 2 layers meet. If you make any mistakes and paint get into areas where they're not supposed to be, before the contrast paints dry, you can wetten your brush with just regular water and clean it up with that moist brush. So when applying the contrast paints, give yourself a little bit extra time. Don't overstretch it and try to rush it to finish everything in 5 minutes. Just a few extra seconds is going to save you time in the long run if you don't have to clean up a ton. On our Space Marine, we're going to do a classic ultramarine using a blue contrast paint. And then just pick out different details with a leather paint and gold trims using a classic acrylic. And bada bing, bada boom, we've got some miniatures that look decent. And if you're just looking to get paint on your armies, you now have a fully playable miniature. This is literally the fastest way for a beginner to get started and get minis ready for games. And it even almost looks like the miniatures are highlighted and shaded thanks to there still being some black left from the black primer, and all the areas that are raised outwards from the miniature are brighter thanks to the white undercoat, more saturated and more vibrant, and this is great! Literally amazing for people just getting started or just want miniatures for playing. However, don't be deceived by this fresh apple-looking red squig. It is tempting to take a bite, but there are some massive downsides of using Slapchop if you want to have a better looking army that stands out or want to become a master of painting miniatures. But before we talk about those, let me show you a quick thing we can do to level up our Slapchop paint jobs with a simple hack. So let's talk about the main problem and how we quickly can fix it with a cheat code. If you want your miniatures to be based in some type of reality, we want all the surfaces angled towards the light source to be the one that are brightest, not the ones that are furthest out from the core of the miniature. As an example, our squig is sort of like a ball, and if you've got a basketball or a football out in nature, the whole top half of the ball would be highlighted, not just the edges of the ball all the way around it. And even if the ball will have a slight dent on the top, if the light comes from above, the area dented inwards still has light hitting it. But with our squig, none of these dents have any highlights on them. Another example would be the nose on the top of the troll. Right now we only have the most raised out area of the nose highlighted, but we want everything that is angled upwards to be highlighted. So if we want to get a little bit more from this technique, before we go in with the dry brushing process, what we can do is just to add a zenithal spray highlight. Meaning that if we have a white spray can primer or an airbrush, we can just add a little bit of white to the very top of the miniature before we go in and dry brush it. This way, all the top areas will be highlighted the same way as things would be highlighted in nature when you're out on a cloudy day. So with the minis zenithally highlighted and then dry brushed again, we can now go in and add all the colors back. And while we do, let me talk about this week's sponsor, Squarespace. 5 years ago, I built my first website with the help of this week's sponsor, Squarespace. And it was so freaking easy, I kid you not. I've known how to do a little bit of designing in Photoshop, but I've always hated programming and known nothing about it. But with Squarespace, not only do they hold my hand with the programming, but also with the layout and design. It is completely free to try to build your own website. If you just follow the link in our video description, you get 30 days to use their system that is now a mix of AI that guides you through designing the website, but also about 2 decades worth of design knowledge and pre-made templates that you can reuse for your purpose. And in my opinion, right now, if you run a business, a side hustle, or maybe a miniature painting service, whatever it may be, just having a social media page is not enough. You need to be able to have your own platform where you show that you are serious and professional, and I think Squarespace is the #1 platform for that. You can host a web shop, you can have a gallery that looks amazing, and you can sell your services easier than ever before. So what are you waiting for? Head to squarespace.com, try to build your own website completely for free, and then when you're ready to launch the website, head to squarespace.com/Squidmar, use the code Squidmar and get 10% off your entire purchase of a website or a domain. Do it now. Your business needs it. Let's get back to meetings. If we now compare our first minis that was only dry brushed with our second set that first had a zenithal spray highlight and then dry brush, I feel like the look of the new ones are just so much better because you have a nice gradient from brighter at the top to darker on the areas that are underneath the miniature, but we still have the crisp details on all the parts that are raised outwards, such as the patterns on the back of the troll and the belt buckle of a Space Marine. I definitely prefer this technique over the first one, and it just takes a few extra seconds when you're priming the mini. If you want to go in with a second hack, if you do own an airbrush, you can go in and shade the miniature with a darker contrast paint from below, adding even more vibrancy in the shadows, but that requires that you have that tool, the airbrush, so it might not be for every beginner. But now I do think we are ready to talk about why you shouldn't use Slapchop. One of the biggest issues that I see with Slapchop is that the miniatures often lack contrast. They feel really flat, to be honest. If we look at our first set of minis that were just dry brushed and then added contrast paints, while they look serviceable, they're also not great looking, especially if we compare them to the minis that I painted using volumetric highlights for my personal army. And while the contrast paints do a decent job of creating some type of shadow and highlight, they do lack the nuanced depth that you get from traditional painting methods. With layering, working with applying highlights with volumetric light as an example, you can build up more realistic gradients and smoothen the transitions between light and dark areas, and maybe even add different tones so you have a colder shadow and a warmer highlight. Slapchop, on the other hand, relies on a one coat and done kind of mentality, which is fine for army painting, but if you want your armies to look better and unique, Slapchop is going to lack and make your army look, quite frankly, mediocre. One upside is that Slapchop is fast. You move quickly over the miniature and over large areas with contrast paints, and often just one tone. But this approach also leaves very little control for the finer areas and the detail work, since the dry brushing only adds highlights to the raised areas. Intricate details like facial structures, folds in fabrics, intricate armor details may get lost or covered up, or just simply feel like they're not painted at all, especially if you're rushing the application and the dry brushing step. On top of that, as we already mentioned, if you paint leather, you have no real tonal variation. It's just a little bit darker tone and a little bit brighter tone on areas that's been dry brushed or not dry brushed. A good example of that would be the squig. If we look at our first red squig, in my army, my red squigs have an orange highlight. That is impossible to get with the contrast paints through a regular brush, because you're going to cover the entire area with just that red. There is no tonal variation. Another major issue that I see is that dry brushing with white have a tendency of leaving your miniature look chalky, because you're doing such a big step from the dark all the way up to the white. It has a tendency to give you an unnatural finish. Of course, you can get better at dry brushing and mastering that technique, but especially on larger areas with a lot of flat panels, you have a high risk of getting a very chalky finish with a very unnatural texture, with flat highlights that don't naturally follow the shapes of the miniature. It often leaves me with a feeling of wanting more on these minis. On top of that, contrast paints on flat areas even more has a tendency of pooling in weird areas, making them look very dirty and uneven on the finish, and it's not in a good kind of way. So kind of to summarize, contrast paints is great if you just want paint on minis. You have no other ambitions, but it does not encourage any whatsoever growth of skill. And that is critical for becoming a better painter in the long run. When you focus primarily on dry brushing and contrast paint, you're bypassing key techniques and understanding of light and volumes, the main things that you need to know and master to become a better painter. So yeah, Slapchop can be somewhat revolutionary just to get those minis painted quickly. especially if you're starting out. But in many ways it can be just as detrimental because you're creating a habit in your painting that is going to stop you from becoming a better painter. Instead, if you're getting started and have just an inkling of a plan to sometime in the future become a better painter, I would recommend to start mastering acrylics. Learn how to apply base coats and adding highlight layers and maybe even blending between those layers. Because if you master the basic techniques of regular acrylics, that is going to give you a foundation that is so much better to have than just dry brushing and putting contrast paints. You can do that later, in later steps in your painting process if you are in need of more minis for your Warhammer tournament. But don't skip learning the fundamentals and understanding what is volumetric highlighting. How do I thin down my paint in my brush to apply it on a miniature? The quicker you learn to build those skills, the faster you are going to improve in the long run as a miniature painter. If you want to learn to paint more like me and Lucas on this channel, we've got a ton of tutorials, anything from beginners classes, ultimate guides for beginners, all the way up to master classes. On top of that, we got a full second channel that is just packed with quick tutorials to teach you how to paint your armies quickly. And the best thing is, we did release a paint set with 36 paints that is regular acrylics. And these 36 paints are the only paints that we use to paint every army that we have. So you don't need to go out and buy 100 different contrast paints and 100 different acrylic paints to actually paint everything. We got you covered with these 3 paint sets and a total of 36 paints. I will link to that down in the video description. A massive thanks to this week's sponsor, Squarespace. And if you want to support us, you can go check out our Patreon. Over there we also have a Discord that is packed with amazing people that will help you along your journey to become a better painter. A special thanks to all of our top donors, you guys are legends. F off and